Hello, hi everyone. Today we have with us Dr. Vijay Prasad, the Executive Director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Research and Chief Editor of the Leftward books. So we as students and teachers of Spanish language would like to know from him about Cuba, Cuban Revolution, and the importance of this day, that is Cuban Rebellion Day, 26th of July. So 26th of July was a movement started by Fidel Castro and his team of revolutionaries, which actually shaped the entire history of Cuba and also Latin America. So because we study Spanish language, we also want to know about the people and the culture, history, society, and the other aspects of the Spanish-speaking countries. And Latin America has the most of the countries which speak Spanish. So that is the reason we are so much interested in this subject. And also Cuba is very special because of the humanitarian help it gives to many countries whenever it is needed, despite of facing difficulties and problems created by the United States and the other imperialist forces. So the journey which Cuba has started in 1959 after the Cuban Revolution has not stopped, although many people have many countries have tried to uh, derail that kind of model which Cuba offers for the world. So today, before I begin this, before I request Dr. Vijay Prasad to speak on this subject, I would like to talk to our students regarding, uh, yeah, uh, about Mr. Dr. Vijay Prasad. He is Executive Director of Tricontinental Institute of Social Science, Social Research, and he is Chief Editor of the Leftward books. And he has written more than 30 books. Recent book which he wrote is called, the name of this book is Washington Bullets. So, and also there was a book about the Peruvian thinker, Jose Carlos Mariátegui. So recently he launched this book, and he is also very Eduardo Galeano is one of his favorites, which I have. I also enjoy reading him, and I really love to listen and read about Eduardo Galeano's writings. So thank you so much, Dr. Vijay Prasad, for accepting this request by the Institute to talk to all of us today.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with the Institute for Spanish Studies. Today is a special day. It's the 26th of July, the day that Fidel Castro and his very brave comrades launched an insurrection against the dictatorship of Batista in 1953. The insurrection itself didn't succeed, but the insurrection opened up a revolutionary dynamic that brought Castro first into prison, then into exile in Mexico. Eventually, they returned, a handful of them, on the Granma, a yacht, went up into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, built the revolutionary process in a deeper way amongst the exploited and oppressed people of Cuba who rose up alongside this small band of revolutionaries linked to the cities. Eventually, in late 1959, 1958-59, and then into 1960, the revolution succeeded. They came into Havana, but Batista vanished and you had the emergence of a new revolutionary government. Before I get deeper into the situation of Cuba itself, I wanted to take a few minutes to give you a slightly personal journey for India's um, Cuba, and in fact, much more precisely, my own Cuba. Cuba first entered my consciousness in 1983 when Fidel Castro came to Delhi to deliver, to be part of the non-aligned meeting, which was held in New Delhi. He was received at the airport by Indira Gandhi. He comes to the auditorium, a man of great, prestige in the non-aligned movement. Now, you've got to remember that Cuba is an island which has a population now about 11 million. 11 million is less than the population of my birth city of Kolkata. It's a very small island with a very small population, 11 million people. It is only 90 miles away from the United States, which for generations had treated Cuba as its playground, a place of casinos, a place to exploit by taking sugar from Cuba at subpar prices, a place to charge high rates of electricity, a place to essentially make money and have fun. That's how the United States treated Cuba for generations. This small island sent its head of government to India in 1983 in the middle of the third world debt crisis, when country after country, including Mexico, a country very much like India, big sprawling country with a capital, Mexico City, sprawling like Delhi, went into default, couldn't withstand the debt crisis that started in 1979 as a consequence of the lift of US interest rates, the so-called Volcker shock, which bankrupted countries like Mexico. And here comes Fidel Castro standing upright, a man of great dignity, standing upright in New Delhi, lecturing the third world countries and telling us that we needed to essentially stand up for ourselves. We needed to refuse the debt crisis, the terms of the debt crisis. We needed to go, in fact, on strike against the payment of debt. 2 years later, in Havana, Castro will host the Havana debt conference. This conference was attended by very many people, including the great Colombian journalist and novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Marquez comes to this conference and later writes, says, look, I'm not an economist. I'm not an economist. I don't understand the details of the debt crisis, but I do know that it's unconscionable that the people of the third world are being forced to pay the price for something that they did not do. They took loans at certain rates. Then just because the United States government lifted interest rates for the US dollar, this impacted the London interbank offer rate, or LIBOR, which destroyed the economic planning of countries, as I said, like Mexico, including India. Here was Castro saying, go on a debt strike. Nobody had the guts to follow him. And for me, and for I think my generation of people in India, the bravery of Fidel Castro and the Cuban people who stood alongside him, who gave him strength, that bravery is unparalleled and needs to be remembered. The second moment when Cuba came to us directly in India was in 1992. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and for reasons that I'll get into in a minute, the USSR played a pivotal role in Cuba's revolutionary development. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Fidel Castro, who made it a habit of giving the most brilliant speeches in the middle of adversity. When Cuba failed its sugarcane harvest in 1970, Castro gives an extraordinarily moving speech, which I very much hope that students of the Institute of Spanish Studies will look at. Very moving speech about the need for resilience, to look inside, to see why the harvest failed, how to improve things in Cuba. Again, when the Soviet Union collapses, Castro gives a series of speeches as Cuba enters what they call the special period. In 1992, as part of the Great Solidarity Campaign for Cuba, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, went around the country. Its mass organizations and the party collected wheat and rice, which was then shipped to Calcutta. In Calcutta, it was boarded on a ship and then carried all the way to Havana. Castro would receive this Indian wheat and Indian rice and say, from now on, the bread that is baked in the bakeries of Cuba should be called Indian bread. Our comrade M.A. Baby was in Havana to deliver the wheat and the rice to Cuba. And I remember participating in that and thinking, this is an amazing thing because we are internationalists. We stand with the Cuban people because the Cuban people have always stood with the oppressed and the downtrodden of the planet. Thirdly, I was very fortunate to go to the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa in 2001, in August, September 2001. Castro was the only world leader to be invited to speak both at the government session, where of course he spoke as the head of government, but he also spoke at the People's World Conference Against Racism. He was invited by, the people's organizations, by trade unions, by peasant organizations. They wanted to hear from Castro. And I can tell you, remarkable, he received a standing ovation in both halls, both in the government hall and in the people's organization. And because I was there, I can tell you also that no other world leader received a standing ovation in either. He received a standing ovation in both halls. Why? Not because it was Fidel Castro, but people were rising up to greet the Cuban people for their resilience, for the fact that they had endured against the imposition of a hybrid war against this island of 11 million people by the forces of imperialism, which from the day that the revolutionaries first struck at Moncada in 26th of July 1953, from that day till today, forces have been arrayed to destroy them, to prevent the success of the Cuban Revolution. For India, Cuba and Castro have meant a great deal. Cuba has always stood with the Indian people. And I'm very proud to say the Cuba solidarity movement inside India has grown, is important, and needs to grow even more. We need to stand firmly with the Cuban people as they continue to deepen their revolutionary process. In 1953, Castro, bright that he was, had made connections with various political parties because they were distressed at the situation in Cuba. Cuba had become essentially, as I said, the playground of the rich from the United States and of multinational corporations, including the electricity company, which charged incredibly high rates to the Cuban people, milked the Cuban people of their small savings just to turn light bulbs on. Castro and his group of friends, comrades, attempted an uprising. Carlos Franchi writes that a few years before 1953, he met Castro. Castro would always carry a book with him. He was a reader, voracious reader. The book that Franchi saw with Castro for the first time was a selected writings of Lenin, with that classic blue cover from Progress Publishers in the Spanish translation. The day of the attack on the Moncada barracks, in the car, after Fidel got out of the car, he left a book behind in the car where he had come to the barracks, and that was the writings of Jose Marti. He was always reading. People who visited Fidel over the years in his office always saw a book somewhere. This was a person who knew, appreciated the importance of history, the importance of study, the importance of a broad understanding of the great social processes of our time. Castro knew in 1953 that the great social process of our time was decolonization, to remove the colonial boot from the neck of people. That was exactly what Castro and his group of comrades attempted to do in 1953. You know, it's no surprise that poets like Carlos Puebla would write a poem where he writes, he says, the Moncada showed us the way to go. And ever since that great example, for us, it is always the 26th, always the 26th, always the 26th. For us, it is always the 26th. As I said, that insurrection, it was an insurrection, not a revolution. It was an attempted insurrection. They recognized later that it was an insurrection, not a revolution. An insurrection is carried out by a group of people on behalf of the people. A revolution is carried out by the people, mobilized, given strength from a group of revolutionaries. But the revolutionaries are not acting alone outside the will of the people. They understood that later. Castro is arrested, put on trial. On trial, he delivers perhaps one of the greatest speeches in the 20th century. It's a speech that now we know as history will absolve me. But people often don't read this speech, and I recommend that you go and read it because it's an extraordinary speech. You know, he begins by saying, and I want to spend a few minutes on the speech. He begins by saying, who are the people? When we say we are conducting an insurrection in the name of the people, he says, who are the people? And then he goes through it. He says, who are the people? We're talking about 600,000 Cubans without work. He's very precise. This text is filled with numbers. He says 600,000 Cubans without work, 500,000 farm laborers, 400,000 industrial workers and laborers, 30,000 teachers and professionals, 100,000 small farmers, 10,000 young professional people, and so on. Who are the people? By the time you add them all up, it's everybody. It's everybody. Who's not the people? Who's not the people is the dictator. Who's not the people? The people who are collaborating with US imperialism, people who are making money against the 500,000 industrial workers and laborers whose retirement funds have been embezzled, whose benefits are being taken away. I would ask you today, let's do the calculation for India. Who are the people? How many million? 700 million peasants who cannot make a living scratching the soil when the big conglomerates are throwing them off the soil and not even hiring them back as agricultural labor. Who are the people? Bank workers, the ASHA workers. You can start enumerating who the people are. That's how Castro begins. Then he says something. He says, you know what? You are charging me with a crime, he says. Let me actually make my indictment even stronger. Had we won, he says, we would have passed 5 revolutionary laws. And he takes the opportunity to go over each of them. Number 1, he says, the 1940 Constitution must be upheld. He says every constitutional provision must be upheld unless the people modify or change it. He says, he was after all a law student. You see, he had faith in the 1940 Constitution, but he also had faith in history. You can't make a revolution outside history. You have to accept that constitution and then modify it. You got to go to the people. This is actually a statement about the people. Second, he says, there must be agrarian reform. Tenant farmers, subtenant farmers must get land. Castro knew this intimately. His father was a Galician farmer who came not with a lot of money from Spain, but became a major landholder, owned hundreds of hectares of land in the eastern provinces. Castro knew about this. He grew up with the children of tenant farmers and subtenant farmers. He understood this. Second law, full agrarian reform. You know, he says the third law would grant workers and employees the right to 30% of the profits of the firm. It's already very radical. Now making 2%, 1% of the full profit goes to he says 30% must be guaranteed. Fourth law, all sugar planters have the right to 55% of sugar production and a minimum quota of 40,000 arubas. I mean, sugarcane workers, the most wretched work because you're working in sugarcane with all the animals that are biting you and the stickiness and the hot sun, the difficulty of growing sugar and the sugar prices collapsing and so on after the Great Depression. He says sugarcane workers must be guaranteed 55% of the sugar money. It's incredible. That was the revolutionary law. The fifth revolutionary law, he said, we'll go through all the accounts and we'll basically confiscate all the holdings and ill-gotten gains of the gangsters in our oligarchy, including the multinational corporations. He says this outright. He says, this is the revolutionary program. I mean, it's because of this that we date the Cuban Revolution in 1953, 26 July. You see, every revolution has many beginnings. One beginning is in an entire history of Cuba. From the early attempt at the Spaniards coming in, people rebelled against them. That's the history of the Cuban Revolution that goes back to the beginning. But the history of this revolution that took place in 5960, this revolution begins in 1953 at Moncada. That is why 26 July is so important. And this is the reason why in October, the 16th of October, when Castro gives a history will absolve me speech on the 16th of October, 1953, he articulates, he provides a full statement of their revolutionary aims before the public. And that is the revolutionary aim. Nothing he says in these 5 laws, he didn't remember in 1959-60. And he says later in his speech, this is a very interesting thing. You can see the integrity of Fidel Castro. He says, the first popularly elected government would have to respect the people, not because of moral obligation to the nation, but because when people, I want you to pay attention to this, he says, not because of moral obligation, but when people achieve something they have yearned for throughout generations, when people achieve something they have yearned for throughout generations, no force in the world is capable of taking it away again. When people achieve something they have yearned for throughout generations, no force in the world is capable of taking it away again. The reason I want you to pay attention to this is the principle of why the Cuban Revolution has endured. Despite the imposition of war by the United States of America and other imperialist countries, despite the harsh conditions created by the embargo and so on, this principle has been learned by every single of the 11 million Cuban citizens. When people achieve something, when they achieve their revolution, which they have yearned for throughout generations, no force in the world is capable of taking it away again. I want this to be ingrained. If we don't understand this statement from 1953, 6 years plus before the actual overthrow of Batista, we don't understand why the Cuban people were able to defend their revolution right through. In the 53 speech, he goes on to explain what he would do, what the Cuban revolutionaries would do if they came to power. He says, you may call me a dreamer, in echo of what John Lennon will write later. He says, to those who call me a dreamer, I quote Jose Marti, and he quotes him. But then here's the end, and this is the famous line. He says, I know that imprisonment will be harder for me than it has been for anyone, filled with cowardly threats and hideous cruelty. But I do not fear prison, as I do not fear the fury of the miserable tyrant who took the lives of 70 of my comrades. Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me. That's beautiful. Okay. Now, 1953, this is the year that the US government has overthrown the democratically elected government in Iran, the government of Mohammad Mossadegh. Why? Because Mohammad Mossadegh had the audacity to demand that the oil underneath the soil of the Iranian people, the oil should be sold and the profits from the oil should benefit the Iranian people. And because Mohammad Mossadegh believed this elementary statement, the United States government and the British government overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh and set Iran on a course which was a very sad history under the Shah of Iran and so on. That is 1953, just when Moncada happens. The next year, and I'm not sure that Castro knew about what was going on in Iran. It's not clear to me. I've never found evidence that he knew about this event. But he certainly knew what happened the next year in 1954 when Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala, again, a relatively moderate, democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacob Arbenz or Jacob Arbenz. Jacob Arbenz said that land owned by the American multinational corporation, United Fruit, excess lands, which United Fruit was not even using, excess lands, should be taken and given to poor campesinos, poor peasants, landless peasants. This is excess land of United Fruit. Now, by the way, Fidel Castro, where he grew up in relative prosperity, his father was a big landowner. Their lands were alongside United Fruit lands in the eastern part of Cuba. He knew United Fruit intimately. This is a big American corporation upon whose board sat the head of the CIA and so on. When Jacob Arbenz moved an agenda, a very modest agenda in Guatemala, to expropriate the excess lands of the United Fruit Company, which it had not been using, the CIA conducted a coup d'etat against him in 1954. Castro was not there. He was by then in Mexico. But Che Guevara was in Guatemala. Che Guevara was in Guatemala. He watched the coup happen. He tried in his small way to mobilize people to defend the coup, but he saw it was no point because the Arbenz government, a liberal to left government, conducted land reform as a policy from above. This was not a policy of the people. The people had not been mobilized. They learned a fundamental lesson from Guatemala in 1954. The lesson that Che Guevara learned, because he was right there, and the lesson that Fidel Castro learned was the people must make the revolution. You cannot do a revolution from above by policy. The people have to be mobilized, have to be galvanized, and they must be ready to defend their revolution by any means necessary. A people who have yearned for something over generations and finally won it, as Castro said in 1953, they will never allow it to be taken from them. But in Guatemala, they didn't feel that they had won it, and it was taken from them by a CIA-backed invasion led by Castillo Armas, one of the most despicable characters of the 20th century, and there are a whole truckload of despicable characters. Well, in Mexico, and when Castro and Che Guevara and others are gathering, Castro is, of course, in touch with revolutionary elements on the island. The 26th of July movement, is galvanizing. When they come in and they arrive in the Sierra Maestra, I think there's a misunderstanding of the process of the revolution from when they arrive in the mountains. This was not a revolution by guns alone. One of Castro's lines that I like a lot is he said after the Soviet Union had collapsed, he said, ideas are more important than weapons. You see, the point wasn't to come to Cuba, go up into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra and then start an armed war against the Batista forces and believe you could defeat them only by arms. No. An insurrection was not going to happen this second time. The first attempted insurrection was in Moncada in 1953, 26 July. This second attempt was a revolution. In the areas up in the mountains, they immediately began to put their revolutionary program into practice. They conducted land reform. They provided medical care. Che Guevara himself, an Argentinian doctor, provided medical care to people. They provided schooling. They started schools. The Cuban communists and revolutionaries immediately went in there and started radical education, popular political education for people. They began to create socialism as they were producing their fight. And that creation of socialism up in the hills, that idea that socialism had arrived, spread through the country, and they became heroic figures. And Batista feared them deeply, and so did the CIA, and so did the Americans, feared them deeply. But there was no stopping the dedication of the Cuban revolutionaries and the Cuban people. Eventually, they will prevail. They come into Havana. Batista flees. It's an incredible thing to imagine that in 1959-60, 90 miles off the shore of the United States of America, a revolution takes place. Initially, when the revolution happens and Batista goes, Castro produces, and the government that comes produces a policy that is brilliant. And I don't have time to get into this, but what I want to say is that they didn't come in and enact, some sort of harsh policies and so on. No, no, no. This was built. You need to build the people's confidence in their government. The first thing he said was the electric company. All these years you charged excessive rates. You charged us excessive rates. Therefore, you owe the Cuban people so much money. Because you are refusing to pay us back all this money, we are going to take your electricity lines and the electricity plant and so on. We will nationalize it, not because we are doing it out of politics, but because there is an economic agreement you've broken. You are not paying us back the ill-gotten gains from bilking the consumer on high rates, much higher rates than you're charging even in the US. And so we are just going to take the electric buildings and so on, the electricity lines, and start producing electricity ourselves, not because we have an ideological predisposition to nationalize everything, but because you are refusing to pay us back. It's a very clever maneuver. They produce socialism by building the confidence of the people, by bringing the people into the conversation. At no point in the early years did the Cuban government, the new Cuban government, say that we don't allow you to do this, we don't allow you to do that. Everything is permissible within the revolution. If you accept the terms of the History Will Absolve Me program, those 5 principles of the Moncada revolutionary agenda, land reform if you accept these things, land reform, no ill-gotten gains. By the way, how many sensitive people, by which I mean the majority of the people on the planet, are against land reform? How many sensitive people are against fraud? We don't want to see ill-gotten gains taken by a few people. We are repulsed by that, especially when there's hunger in the world. We want the elementary thing for sensitive people, good thinking people, which is the majority of the planet, is to see no child go to sleep at night hungry. I believe, I know, I don't believe, I don't hope, I know that the majority of the world's people are against hunger. Well, to tackle hunger, you have to pay for it with the surplus produced by the people. That means you're going to look around and say, the people are producing sufficient surplus. Why is it that there are hungry people? Because some people are taking too much of the surplus. Those are either through fraud or ill-gotten gains, or because the system is rigged toward them. How do we draw some of that surplus? To abolish hunger, an elementary desire of the human people. We want to abolish hunger. We want to create literacy. We want to create a medical system that treats people, that prevents preventable disease from going. Castro here is lyrical when he says things like, you are upset that a young child is dead, but every day because of your policy, young children walk to school, they have no shoes on. Through their feet enter disease. In India, it's routine for children through their feet, little cut in the foot, they'll get hookworm, they'll get ringworm, and these worms will come, and then you will begin to find yourself being eaten from within. Your whatever nutrition you take in, the worms will get. This is an elementary problem to solve. You have to put some shoes on people's feet. You have to provide medical care so they don't suffer from worms. It's very easy to deworm a person, but you need a public health system for that. You need the ability for people to buy slippers, shoes, and so on, to keep their feet clean, to make sure they don't have cuts. Simple things. Castro says in the 53 speech, you are upset when one child dies, but you're not upset when millions of children walk to school bare feet and collect diseases, and they die slowly, not getting killed, one child in some cruel death somewhere. That upsets you, but you must be upset by this slow death of millions of people. Sensitive, decent people are upset. And that is what the Cuban Revolution began to do. It said, nobody in Cuba will be hungry, nobody in Cuba will be illiterate, and nobody in Cuba will be allowed to be sick if we can help it. Some illnesses you can't cure. It's not, socialism isn't magic. But if you can help it, for instance, things like ringworm and whatever, hookworm and so on, these should be abolished. You cannot allow the diseases of poverty to linger. Look at India, where the diseases of poverty are legion. We're talking about COVID-19. The way in which people die in India, it's atrocious. These are diseases of poverty, totally unnecessary. If people are well fed, if they are literate, if they have the ability to protect themselves from certain things, you will not have the diseases of poverty. And one of the most grotesque diseases of poverty, of course, is hunger, lack of nutrition. It's an obscenity. It should not be allowed. This is what the Cuban Revolution meant for us, that from the first year onward, they began to tend to the basic needs of the people. And this is why the Cubans decided, rather than use our surplus to build a big military, we will build a medical establishment, we will build an educational establishment. It is the reason why Cuba has one of the world's best public health systems. You may not be able to get the most sophisticated surgery and so on, but you will have the very best public health in that system, and every Cuban is entitled to the public health system. It's a fundamental achievement of the Cuban Revolution, and that is the reason why in the middle of COVID-19, you don't see German doctors going to Iran, or you don't see American, US doctors going to West Africa. You see Cuban doctors going abroad, tending to people, teaching them about how to tackle COVID-19 before that Ebola. You also see Chinese doctors going to Palestine, leading workshops and so on. You don't see doctors from the UK, you don't see doctors from the US, you don't see doctors from Germany, from Italy, from the advanced capitalist countries. In fact, you don't even see Indian doctors in South America, but you see Cuban doctors. Why? Because the achievement of the revolution was the very basic needs of the people must be fundamentally taken care of. This was an abomination to the United States. And I want to bring in Haiti for a minute. When the Haitian Revolution took place, the first major proletarian revolution in the world in the early 19th century, it had to be crushed. The reason the French, the Americans, and others attempted to crush the Haitian Revolution was they were not going to permit a people who had been at one point humans who were property of other humans, what we call slaves. I dislike the term slaves. These are humans who were property of other humans. When these humans decided that they no longer wanted to be the property of other humans, the slave-owning societies of France, the United States, and so on, had to crush Haiti because they couldn't allow the Haitian Revolution to succeed. It would set a bad example for the rest of the Americas and elsewhere. But the Haitians fought them and to some extent maintained their independence, but they had to pay an indemnity to France. That's another story, grotesque. That was in 1804, 1805. Nothing changed when we get to 1959. Cuba was not going to be permitted by the imperialists, by the United States and its allies to exist, because Cuba was giving an example to the world that you can abolish hunger, you can abolish illiteracy, and you can create a system of medical care for people, basic system. You're not going to have a capitalist economy in a poor country. You're going to do something different. It was not going to be permitted to exist. And it's the United States that imposed a war on Cuba, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to try and overthrow the Cuban Revolution, including an invasion of Cuba, including an invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and over 600 attempts to personally assassinate Fidel Castro. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to impose war on Cuba. What did Cuba do? Has Cuba ever tried to assassinate a US president? Never. Has Cuba ever tried to overthrow the government in the United States? Never. Has Cuba ever intervened inside the United States with some sort of military action? Never. Everything that the United States did to Cuba, Cuba did not try to do in the United States. I want you to take a breath and think about that. Cuba has never imposed war on anybody. Instead, it has sent doctors. The only time Cuban military intervention came of great significance was when the Cuban people were invited by the National Liberation Fighters of Angola to help them defeat the apartheid South African invading army. At that time, at the invitation of the National Liberation Fighters of Angola to defend their country against the South African apartheid army, Cuba sent military forces and military aid and defeated the apartheid regime at the Battle of Quito Conivale in 1987, which to my mind was one of the signature victories of the people of Africa against South African apartheid and led to the destruction of apartheid in South Africa. Cuba plays a role in defending, in producing the end to apartheid in South Africa. That's the really only time where Cuba directly militarily intervenes outside its boundaries. Otherwise, it has not imposed a war on anybody. It has had war imposed on it, and not just a conventional war, but also a hybrid war. By hybrid war, we mean an information war. You know, the United States has tried to disparage Cuba around the world, saying it's authoritarian, they are against this, against human rights, and so on. Let me tell you something that's interesting. I have understood Cuba and watched Cuba and experienced the Cuban Revolution for a long time. Cuba, the Cuban government, has never assassinated people who don't agree with what's happening in Cuba. The Cuban government has not assassinated popular leaders of movements and so on. You know, if you compare what is happening today in Colombia, in the government of Ivan Duque, where social movement leaders are being assassinated weekly, where people are weekly just killed off, trade union leaders, leaders of Afro-Colombian organizations and so on. Routine disparagement of human rights in Colombia. But Colombia is an ally of the United States. No criticism. Cuba is an adversary of the US model. But in Cuba, what do you see? You know, people who take positions, who start organizing to overthrow the government, at most they are put in prison. That's part of the Cuban constitution. They are not killed. You know, there is no mass assassination going on in Cuba. It's very interesting how the battle of ideas works, information warfare. A portrait is produced of Cuba that Cuba somehow is, is an authoritarian society. You want an authoritarian society? Go visit Colombia, talk to the social movement leaders there. You will experience what authoritarianism is, with gangs of nasty far-right thugs in these so-called paramilitary cocaine organizations that go off around and kill people at the behest of the government. It's ridiculous. I mean, when you look at it, an economic warfare against Cuba, the sanctions, the embargo, and so on. A warfare to blockade Cuba, not just for economic reasons, but to actually just, try to suffocate the Cuban people on the island. But they've broken that suffocation. They've always found allies, not only in South America, but around the world. People have welcomed the Cuban people as people who are heroic in their fight against this attempt to suffocate them. They are building socialism in an island that was colonized, in an island whose structures were produced to benefit US capitalism. It is very hard to build socialism in that context. This is not building socialism in Germany in 1919, if the German Revolution had succeeded, or building socialism in the UK if they had had a revolution in 1920 or so on. All major revolutions in the 20th century have taken place in extremely poor countries. The Tsarist Empire, Mongolia, Vietnam in 1945, China in 1949, and Cuba in 1959. Very poor countries have had revolutions, and they have had to struggle against their poverty to produce the basic needs for the people. I want you to have some sense of balance when you compare what the Cubans have been able to do and others. And I want you to think about the following fact, that in Cuba, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, 29,000 medical students left their dormitories and went and tested 11 million people on the island. We at Tricontinental did a document which you can download for free called Corona Shock and Socialism, where we look at Kerala, the state of Kerala, Vietnam, Venezuela, and Cuba, and we assess the way in which they've been able to hold down the COVID-19 pandemic. In Vietnam and in Laos, there have been no deaths. Imagine that, two countries with borders with China, no deaths. Cuba, amazing how they've been able to tackle the situation. Finally, and I think, Ranjit, I'll end with this and then I can take questions and so on. Finally, I want to return us to 1953. Nobody would have imagined in 1953 that a small band of revolutionaries would have been able to overthrow the dictatorship of Batista untangle Cuba from US imperialism and produce a revolution that has lasted from 1959 to the present. Nobody would have imagined that in 1953. It took an enormous amount of will to imagine that this would be possible. But I want to return to 53 and 54 because I want to just say something particular. After the revolution took place, and in fact, during the revolution from 56 to 59, during this period, building the confidence of the Cuban people and having the Cuban people recognize that the revolution was their revolution was an incredibly important task of the revolutionaries. They understood from the lesson of Guatemala in 54 that you can't just provide an agenda from above. The people must be mobilized. I mean, when Cuba was attacked in the Bay of Pigs in 1961, it was not a military that defended the beaches of Cuba against the attackers. It was ordinary Cuban people who went there to defend their revolution. The Cuban people had been armed, not just armed with weapons. I want to emphasize that. They'd been armed with the idea. They'd been armed with the idea that this was their world, that the world they lived in was a world whose image they could produce. It was not a world that was imposed on them by history or which was being imposed upon them by a dictatorship or by imperialism. This was their world. If they wanted to do something, they must have a voice to do that something. And that is the reason why they went out on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs to defend against the invasion, of the CIA-backed force. And that is why even till today, experiencing extreme adversity, the Cuban people are dignified in their defense, not of their revolution alone, but of this elementary idea that they have confidence and certainty, that their voices matter, that they can produce the world in their image, that the world should not be imposed on them. The real message of the Cuban Revolution is not what Cuba has done, but the real message is to us, the rest of us. The real message is, do we have confidence that we can produce a world which is not imposed on us by history or imposed on us by terrible forces that dominate us? Do we have confidence that we can take our sensitive, genuine ideas and produce a world in the image of those ideas? Ideas, Castro said after the fall of the Soviet Union, are much more powerful than weapons. The Cuban Revolution has given us a series of ideas. The most important of those ideas is dignity and confidence. We need to take those lessons seriously. Thanks a lot. Now, okay. You're muted. Ranjeet, comrade, you're muted. Let's see what you're saying.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Vijay Prasad, for such an informative talk about Cuba, Cuban Revolution, and the Cuban Rebellion Day. On this day, in Cuba, people are celebrating this day because on this particular day, they understood that this revolution is going to be successful. And after this talk, I would also like to request you to kindly tell us about the changes which Obama administration did, and Trump administration is trying to undo those changes. And recently I read in a newspaper that an employee of Cuban embassy in Washington ordered a product from the website of Amazon, and the government of United States considers that if an employee of a Cuban embassy is being sold a product, then it is a violation of the embargo because it is a trade between the United States and Cuba, which shouldn't happen. So kindly let us know about this. And also we would like to request you to talk about the medical help which Cuba is giving in the Latin American countries and also in the in Europe and Africa, and United States government, Trump administration is telling or pressurizing the government not to accept those medical help or Cuban doctors in those countries. Thank you.
Yes, so let's first talk about the Obama administration. This is known as the Cuba thaw. It is true that during 2016, toward the end of Obama's time in office, he did start or he did deepen a series of measures, to ease relations, as they say, between the United States and Cuba. Um, Before we get to that, one has to understand that right up to 2016, so from 1960 to 2016, the United States government essentially tried to tie a noose around Cuba and kept it very tight. I want people to understand that. Now, the Cuban people fought off the noose and continued to breathe. So let's not imagine that Cuba was actually suffocated by this. The people are extraordinarily dignified and didn't permit themselves to be defined by the embargo. But this embargo was very significant, and the various bills that came after the fall of the Soviet Union that attempted to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution were very significant. They tightened things after the fall of the USSR, hoping, oh, now Cuba is in a special period, we can get rid of the revolution. That was the idea. By the time Obama comes, the kind of policy, US policies against Cuba were extreme. So Obama initially didn't say, let's remove the garrote. He just said, let's loosen it a little bit. You see, one of the things is that the United States government has designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, which is a crazy idea. I mean, in what way has Cuba sponsored terrorism? I mean, if you look at the US indictment, so-called indictment against Cuba, it's empty. Okay, has Cuba sponsored terrorism? What is terrorism? What do we mean by terrorism? Was the war of the Angolan people against apartheid South Africa, is that terrorist? It's actually true that Dick Cheney, who was once vice president of the United States under George W. Bush, called Nelson Mandela a terrorist in the 1980s. He said Nelson Mandela is a terrorist. Yes, I and you, Ranjeet, we support Nelson Mandela. And if we had a government, we would provide support to the forces of Nelson Mandela. If the US says that Mandela is a terrorist, then we are state sponsors of terrorism. But do we accept that Mandela is a terrorist? Not at all. Mandela is a freedom fighter. Mandela was fighting against the hideous apartheid system. So the US government says Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. The Cuban government, quite rightly in the Obama years, said, listen, all this is fine, easing visa restrictions, allowing money, families to go back and forth. We accept all this. But you have to remove this designation of state sponsor of terrorism, and you have to end the economic blockade of Cuba. This is a fundamental issue. You see, Cuba has to have the right, as a member of the United Nations, to free commercial, political, cultural interaction with the world. Why should Cuba be treated as a special case? There is no reason for Cuba to be treated as a special case. Why can't Cuba have free and open commerce with people? Venezuela, again, under illegal, unilateral US sanctions. Iran sent 5 oil tankers to Venezuela. By the way, Venezuela was paying for that oil. It's a basic commercial interaction. United States government threatened to interdict the ships on high seas. It's a basic commercial transaction. We're not talking about solidarity, we're sending free, like India sent wheat in 1992. No, this is a basic commercial interaction. Cuba should have the right to sell things and buy things. So these are against the UN Charter, frankly. These are extraordinary sanctions. They don't belong, they're not on the basis of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. And therefore, in my opinion, that's why I call these illegal sanctions. They are not in accord with Chapter 6 of the UN Charter. You can go and read Chapter 6 of the Charter. What has Cuba done You see, Chapter 6 of the Charter has a standard. You can sanction countries if they've done certain things like genocide against their own people and so on. What has Cuba done? Oh, yes, these are the crimes of Cuba. Cuba has abolished hunger by and large. Cuba has abolished literacy by and large. Cuba has created a public health system, the envy of the developing world. These are crimes in the eyes of the United States government. If this is terrorism, then Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism and so on. These are absurd things. So the Cuban government said, look, how can we negotiate with you in good faith? We'll accept all the openings you're doing. We want to end the embargo. So we are not being stubborn. We'll accept everything, but you must remove these things. Well, to his credit, Obama said, fine, we can remove you as a state sponsor of terrorism because you haven't for this long period sponsored terrorism. That's how he put it. He sent a bill to Congress, didn't get through. I mean, there was a thaw in the Obama years, but let's not exaggerate it. Okay, I mean, I really think it's overly exaggerated. This was not. They did not take a position saying, okay, we were wrong. From 1960 to 2016, we were wrong in the way we tried to overthrow the government. No, they have never changed their regime change objective against Cuba. They simply eased up certain things with the view, and I want to underline this, that this new policy was going to accelerate regime change in Cuba, not to prevent it. This new policy of Obama was going to be a new way to accelerate regime change. That was the goal, frankly. So the goal of US power had not changed, merely the techniques. When Trump came in, Trump is a much more ideological Cold Warrior, and under John Bolton, his completely, insane national security advisor gave a speech in Miami attacking the communist tyranny in the Caribbean and South America. And he said, we will overthrow the governments of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. That's what he openly said. He openly declared that the Trump administration is going to conduct regime change against Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And they've been doing a policy of that. So they hardened the position against Cuba. But I want to say again, Ranjeet, that at no point has the American government stepped back from the position that the US government has the right to overthrow the government in Cuba. That yes, they changed their techniques, but they didn't change the objective. If you truly need to see a change, you need to see a government say, we no longer have the policy of trying to overthrow the government in Cuba. And that is not something that I've ever heard from any US administration, certainly not from the Obama administration. Now, you asked about medical assistance in South America and other parts of the world. You see, it's very important to say that there was an American soldier, Harry Reeve, who fought in the War of Independence for the Cuban people against Spain. American soldier went to that side. In the 2000s, Cuba created a brigade, essentially, of medical personnel who were going to go abroad and provide medical services, particularly in developing countries, but not only. This was called the Harry Reeve Brigade. Now, recently, they have been nominated by people's organizations for the Nobel Prize. And I very much would like people to go and look, and I can find the link somewhere. You'll find it, just type Nobel Prize. Ranjeet, if you can type it, Nobel Prize, Harry Reeve Brigade, Cuban doctors, something, there's a website. I very much want people to go and give support to this initiative. And the reason is, since 2005 or so, Cuban doctors have been traveling around the world providing assistance. Now, this is the period of neoliberal austerity, when many countries, many developing countries began to cut away, slice away, particularly after the financial crisis, slice away at public health, funding for public health, destroy whatever minimal infrastructure. During the Ebola crisis in West Africa, it was Cuban doctors who went into households where there was Ebola and treated people, and the heroic doctors infected with Ebola, brought out of the country, went back to Cuba, were treated, healed, and then returned to West Africa. Extremely brave doctors. They didn't ask for rewards from anybody. They went because they served the people. At a time when austerity had destroyed public health around the world, when the International Monetary Fund had forced the countries of West Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so on, to cut back on healthcare funding, which produced the Ebola crisis. If you have public health systems there's early warning, there's an ability to isolate people to take care of these public health crises. It's not rocket science, you need public health infrastructure. But the IMF had forced these countries to cut, and it was the Cuban doctors who came to pick up the pieces. So what the Hariri Brigade, what Cuban doctors have done in the last essentially 15 years is they provided an auxiliary against IMF-induced cuts to public health. When there's an earthquake in Pakistan, Cuban doctors show up. In Brazil, the Cuban doctors were there providing primary health care to poor people in the favelas. This is what we salute Cuba for, because they said we will produce medical care as our export, not weapons. The United States, Britain, they export weapons. Cuba exports doctors. Well, yes, you want me to talk a little bit. Oh, there's a good question about Morales. May I talk about that?
Please.
Okay, this last week, Elon Musk, who is the 5th richest man on the planet Earth, it seems now. And by the way, when I say 5th richest, I just mean in terms of his bank account. He is definitely not the richest in terms of humanity, and certainly not the richest in terms of culture and social life. This is a man whose family profited from emerald mines in apartheid South Africa. He's now the owner of Tesla and SpaceX. He sent a tweet out this week saying that, we'll coup any country we want, essentially, intemperate text. We'll make a coup anywhere we want. Well, he's referring to Bolivia. In November 2019, the government of Evo Morales Ayma, who I'm very proud to say wrote a terrific preface to my new book, Washington Bullets, which you can get as an ebook from Leftward. There's the advertisement. It's a very well-priced ebook, just to let you know. But Comrade Morales wrote a terrific preface to it, and I'm very proud. And the reason I'm especially proud is the book is about coups and assassinations. And his is the most recent of the coups. If you can draw a straight line from Arbenz 1954, Mossadegh 53 to Evo Morales 2019 November. Why was Morales overthrown? Not because of anything to do with election fraud. And by the way, now, after many months of destroying Bolivian democracy, the New York Times writes an article agreeing that there was really no evidence of election fraud. After the coup has taken place, they say, well, there was no, but there's nobody going to bring Mr. Morales back. I mean, this is the situation of democracy as far as imperialist countries are concerned. Why was he overthrown? Well, he was overthrown because for 14 years, his government, the Movement to Socialism government, for 14 years, used the resources of Bolivia to improve the conditions of the Bolivian people, inspired by the Cuban Revolution. Now, pay attention to this. From the 1500s, the Bolivian people have been under the yoke of imperialism. They've seen their resources stolen to profit Spain, to profit the United States, and so on. Every time the Bolivian people have tried to move an agenda, they have had their agenda crushed, including by real-life Nazis like Klaus Barbie, who comes there to advise the fascistic Bolivian government in the 1950s on how to destroy the communist movement. It's in Bolivia that Che Guevara is killed in 1967, attempting to overthrow this fascistic government where the real life Nazis who escaped from Europe after 1945 came to build the anti-communist secret service in Bolivia, led by Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Despicable characters. The man who actually oversees the killing of Che Guevara in Bolivia is trained by Klaus Barbie, a real life Nazi. Evo Morales, when he comes to power now 15 years ago, had behind him a history of the suppression of the Bolivian people for centuries. I mean, inequality rates were not increased necessarily in the 10 years before Morales. They have been high for centuries, since the 1500s. So Morales had an incredible task ahead of him to change the situation, but that brave Movement to Socialism party led by Evo Morales and his vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linera, moved an agenda whereby the 2019 speech that Morales gives at the United Nations General Assembly, and I would very much like you to go and listen to that speech. The speech that Evo Morales gives at the UN General Assembly in 2019, just before he's overthrown, he lists the improvement in livelihood of the Bolivian people, and it is very impressive, and it's real. It's real. Every piece of data that he uses there is verified data. Hunger levels dropped, literacy rates rose, and the medical care for people improved. These are the three essential things a left government has to do, and they did it. They were pursuing a project of resource socialism, using the wealth of the resource to improve the conditions of people. This is just what the Cuban Revolution had taught us. And he had to be overthrown. By the way, his term of office wasn't to end until January 2020. His term of office from his third election victory. They contested his fourth election victory. In November, 2 months before his third term ended, the military knocked on his door, military which had liaison with the United States, knocked on his door and told him leave office. This was a genuine military coup. There was no reason for the military to knock on his office in November. His third term constitutionally did not expire till January. It was a coup, and they brought an insignificant politician, Jeanette Anez, to come to office. She illegitimately, no constitutional norms followed, came to power in November. We are now in July. Today is July 26, 2020. The election was supposed to have been in May, postponed to September, now postponed to October. For 1 whole year, the Bolivian people will not have had the experience of an elected government. I mean, the United States backed a coup d'etat in November 2019 against Evo Morales Ayma. Today, the US-backed illegal government in Bolivia, I want you to consider this, is refusing to hold an election because every single poll in Bolivia shows that Luis Arce, who leads the movement to socialism now after Evo Morales, is sure to win the election. And the second place person will be Carlos Mesa, a center-right politician who used to be the president of Bolivia. And Ms. Anez is coming third at 13%, far behind Arce up to 41, 42%. So they are refusing. They are doing another coup against the democratic process. They did a coup in November 2019. This is an ongoing coup against the democratic process. They're not allowing an election to take place in Bolivia. Even in Ecuador, they're going to put off elections, and they'll use the pandemic as a reason to put off elections. They want to open the economy, let people go out there and do economic activity, but they won't allow elections. Now, I want you to breathe in a little bit about how undemocratic they are in the name of democracy. And meanwhile, the movement to socialism guaranteed to win if there was a genuine election, because an important poll showed that 65% of the population of Bolivia is in favor of the policies of the movement to socialism government. That means that government didn't govern from above. Like the Cuban Revolution, it built support from below. Okay. Wow. Okay. How social? Somebody has asked a good question. Oh, well, let me take the previous comment. Socialism is returning in the time of COVID-19, economic recession. Socialist policies will not materialize until there are chronic capitalists. How so will succeed in the present atmosphere of crony capitalism? Okay, good. Post-truth nationalist governments. Excellent question. How do we as socialists, sensitive, decent humans who believe that the world is not benefiting people, how are we able to move an agenda in a post-truth, right-wing, fascistic type environment where crony capitalism is the norm and so on? Excellent question. I don't know the answer to that, to tell you the truth. I'm not an oracle. The answer is that we have to build in our movements. We have to participate in building the strength of people. It is a so-called post-truth media, the mainstream media and so on. We have to build our own media. We have to go to the people with our own messages. You know, we need to have the ability to build the confidence of people. There is no easy answer to this. Building a revolutionary process is not easy, friends. Somebody has asked a question. Indian communists had a great opportunity to mobilize the laborers, including migrants, but they did nothing. It's not true. It's entirely not true. Excuse me. It's not true that they did nothing. I think that's a very wrong statement. They did nothing. I mean, they've been doing a lot, but how do you do enough? Firstly, in the great state of Kerala, the government has done a lot. They fought this pandemic with science, with public action, with the public sector, with an internationalist spirit. That's in Kerala. But in the rest of the country, the Indian communists have been out there struggling to fight against this, a change in the labor law, to fight to get people basic relief and so on. It's not easy to move an agenda, in a situation where you have a fascistic order, you have a ruling party which has complete disregard for basic human needs, human wants. I mean, it's striking that the suddenness of demonetization is replicated by the suddenness of the lockdown. In both cases, the government didn't prepare at all, didn't provide a scientific approach, didn't explain to people what was to happen, and so on. It was done catastrophically. It's difficult to build a movement. I mean, I wish everybody who said to me, why haven't the communists done this or that? I wish those people were involved in the movement, because that's already about 1 million people who make those objections. Then we'd have 1 million people in a political party trying to change the needle of history. It takes organization, it takes will, it takes struggle to change things. You want a lesson from the Cuban Revolution? It wasn't made by people who sat in Havana and criticized Fidel Castro and the other Moncada rebels. The revolution was made by people across Cuba who decided to get involved in the revolution, to get involved in overthrowing the Batista dictatorship. I would say to every question that says, how do you do this? Why do you do that? I would say, get involved. If you're not involved, I don't see how you can be alive today. That's the message of Castro. He said to the Cuban people that I know you want to join us. I know you want to join us. I know that what's stopping you from joining us is perhaps your lack of confidence in our ability to succeed. That's always what prevents people from joining the good side of history. They're afraid that we are too utopian, we are too much dreamers, and we won't succeed. And that holds people back. Well, if that's all that's holding you back, that's not enough. If it's not fear that's holding you back and merely a sense that, we're dreamers. Well, as Castro said at the end of his History Will Absolve Me, everybody calls me a dreamer. But as he says, everybody calls me a dreamer. And maybe, Ranjit, at the end, I'll read out that Jose Marti line. Anything else, my friend? And how much longer shall we go?
I think we already have few questions which you already answered.
Okay.
So it's around 7:50 p.m. So we can wind up in the next 10 or 5 minutes.
Excellent. 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll just start winding up by going back to 1953, Ranjit. Is that okay?
Yeah. Because today is the day to talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, insurrections are interesting business because Lenin, in the middle of 1917, said insurrection is an art, is the phrase Lenin uses. Insurrection is an art. It's not a science. You don't know when to attempt something. But you have to have the capacity to believe the people are already with you. They have a sense of the movement. In 1953, they were not convinced that the people were with them. It was a leap. Lenin also writes in the margins of Hegel's logic in 1917 again, he writes, leaps, leaps, leaps. He writes in the margin, leaps, leaps, leaps. He says, sometimes you have to take a leap. The second revolution in 1917 was a leap. They had to make a leap of faith that the people could take charge of the new Soviet Republic. They had to take a leap. But in 53, they also took a leap. They were testing, in a sense, would the people come with us? And, it was not going to happen. They hadn't built the revolutionary process with enough fortitude, resilience, patience. It takes patience to build a revolutionary process. Um, Nonetheless, it was an act of incredible heroism, and 70 people were executed as a consequence of it. They paid for their lives. We should remember them today. We should always remember our comrades who fall in the pursuit of making a revolution happen. In India, we have lost so many people. So many people have been murdered by the far right. So many people have been killed for what they believe in, what we believe in, for being sensitive people. I mean, I like to think of socialists basically as sensitive people. We are sensitive. We are moved by the great tragedies of hunger, illiteracy, indignity, the wretchedness of caste in India, the horrendousness of the way misogyny works, hatred of women. We are sensitive people. We are moved by this. If you're a person in India and you are not moved by the wretchedness of caste, you have to wonder, how do you live like that? That when you see 1 million people, largely on caste lines, forced to enter sewage, to clear sewage lines. In front of your eyes, a human being goes into a sewer to clear a sewage lines largely on the basis of caste. That is a wretched institution. Sensitive people are moved by that. So many people join our movement because that moves them. They don't want to live in a society where that persists. We have enough machines to do work like that, and yet because it's cheaper to have human beings go down there, despite the fact that it's illegal. If in India we had, if Castro was an Indian, and if he laid out his revolutionary laws, I would hope the first law would be that we will forbid human beings to enter sewers. It is already against our constitution. We'll uphold our constitution, forbid human beings to enter sewers. We will mechanize this immediately. It doesn't matter how much money it takes. If Ambani is going to build that ridiculous house in Bombay, the cost of that house itself would pay for enough machines in Indian cities to prevent human beings from going into the sewer. That's the first revolutionary law. Because why? We are sensitive people. We are moved against the wretchedness of caste, of all hierarchies, the way in which communalism functions, but above all of hunger, of the way children have to walk to school bare feet. These are things that move us. That's what makes you a socialist. It's not that I read a book by Lenin or I read a book by Marx. What makes you a socialist is that you find it an abomination that a child has to walk to school bare feet and then pick up diseases and is racked by the diseases of poverty and where his nutrition goes. Lives must matter. Lives are precious. That's what moves us into this. So the insurrection of 53, it didn't succeed, but it was moved by incredibly sensitive people who believe life is precious, and 70 of them gave their lives. At the dock, in History Will Absolve Me, Castro responds to people who say you are a dreamer. And he does like he often does by quoting Jose Marti. Every year on July 26th, while Castro was alive, he gave a brilliant speech in Havana. When he was a brilliant speech on 26th July, where he explained the roots of the Cuban Revolution and the conjuncture in which the Cubans found themselves that particular year on 26th July. It's often a tour de force of history and of politics. He would give a long speech every year, and he would always quote from Jose Marti. Remember, when he goes to fight in Moncada, he leaves a book behind in the car, and it's a book of the writings of Marti, the great Cuban nationalist hero. So he says, "To those who call me a dreamer, I quote the words of Marti." And then here's a big quotation. Okay, I want you to really breathe this in. "A true person does not seek the path where advantage lies." A true person does not seek the path where advantage lies. That means if you're a true person, you're not just going to go and try to make money and so on. That's where advantage lies. But rather the path where duty lies. And this is the only practical person whose dream of today will be the law of tomorrow. Because this person who has looked back on the essential course of history and has seen flaming and bleeding peoples seethe in the cauldron of the ages, knows that without a single exception, the future lies on the side of duty. A true person does not seek the path where advantage lies, but rather the path where duty lies. The real question to ask yourself, especially young people, the real question to ask yourself is, what is your duty? What are you called to do in the world? What do you think your ambition is? Is it your ambition to become rich, or is it your duty to produce a better world? That was Castro's answer to people who said, Fidel Castro, you're just a dreamer. And he said, no, listen to what Marty says. Marty said, you will seek that the dream of today will be the law of tomorrow. The dream of today will be the law of tomorrow. In other words, what we hope for today will become reality. Our hopes are not mere utopia. Our hopes are the future reality. And that's what they did in Cuba, and that's what they're maintaining in Cuba. So maintain your own solidarity with Cuba, but what we need to see is every country in the world become like Cuba. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vijay Prasad. And definitely, because the last point which you made, it is similar thing Eduardo Galeano has also said about utopia. So he says that in Spanish, he says that utopia está en el horizonte. Utopia is in the horizon. I'm not sure when I will reach it, but it when I come nearer to it, it causes me to advance. That is the reason why I dream. This is what Galeano says. And there are we have many students who do not who are not able to. They say that I just want to learn the language. So I say them that language is about humans, people who speak it. And if we do not learn about them, what they have, what they don't have, what they think, what they need. So it is language is also it should be it should touch all the aspects of the lives of the people. I do not know the meaning of a word called philologia in Spanish, but what I have gathered, what I have sensed, the philologia means that uh, by learning a language, we should also try to learn the other aspects of the life. Like literature is part of philologia, politics and society and history is part of philologia. So also when we are talking about history, people love history, but people hate politics. This is a difficult thing to do. How, I don't know how they do it. So today's politics will become tomorrow's history. So if you're not part of the political process today, then you will not be part of the history. And I feel that if you're not part of the right side of the history, then we should ask this question to ourselves: where we are, what are we doing with our lives today? So tomorrow, the next generation will ask us what were you doing when this was happening. So on behalf of the Institute, I'm very thankful to you to take this much time for this occasion, which was the Cuban Rebellion Day, the day of hope for Cuba. And definitely Cuba gives hope to many countries of the world and many people in the world, especially in the crisis like this, Corona. Many people ask this question that socialism is coming back. Definitely, you need those things. You need support of the governments. You need to build better systems, and you need to make the state stronger. It may not be communism, but it could be socialism. You cannot allow your governments to sell the properties uh, which are the national properties, national companies. Thank you so much. And I thank all the people who took time to join this session and enjoyed the conversations, the questions. I tried my best to send all the questions to the speaker, But in case I couldn't do anything or I couldn't send any question, kindly forgive me. We may try to chat with you separately and try to find the answer for those questions. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Muchas gracias.
Bye.
Bye. Muchas
Bye.
gracias. Adiós.
Adios.